The message today, we're going to be talking about really a very important central core Bible theme, dealing with the beauty of sacrifice. Sacrifice. And typically when we think about sacrifice, we recoil a little bit at the idea because it makes us think of some form of horrific self-denial. And it is true that sacrifice can mean the greatest form of self-denial at all, laying down your life. Remember hearing a story from World War II where First Lieutenant John Robert Fox was there stationed in Italy during the heat of the battle, and his job was an advanced position where he was looking with binoculars and he was giving instructions and coordinates to the artillery operators to bring in the bombs and artillery on various positions. And he'd call on the radio, he'd say, enemies in this position, rain down artillery and bombs here. You know, the enemy, they're over here. And then somehow up this valley, he suddenly noticed that he had missed this large German Nazi force that was coming right in upon him. Well, he could have dropped everything and run for his life and been okay, but he knew that they would surprise his own men and that there was going to be a great loss of life. So he called in the coordinates and he said, you need to drop everything you've got on this position. And on the other end of the radio, they said, well, that's where you are. He said, you better do it, and you better do it fast. And they reined in the artillery, and it took his life when the American forces finally came to the position there. It was in the town of Somocolonia, Italy. They saw that there was Lieutenant Fox surrounded by about 100 dead German soldiers, and they took a medal and they placed it on his chest because he had truly realized that other people's lives will be lost if I don't call in the fire on my position. And really, this is what Jesus did, is he called in all the wrath of the devil on his position so that we could be saved. Now that's the purest form of sacrifice when we think of someone laying down their life. And Jesus said in John 15:13, greater love has no man than this, that someone would lay down his life for another. Sacrifice. Sacrifice is really a beautiful thing. And it might be good to look at a definition as we go on with this. Sacrifice is, by definition, and this is not the total definition, forfeiture or giving up of something highly valued for the sake of someone or something considered to have greater value or claim. It's giving up something or sacrificing, forfeiting something that you value to obtain something you think is of great worth. And we must be very valuable to the Lord that he would sacrifice his life to save us. Now, sacrifice for the Christian is not optional. There's a misconception that has somehow filtered its way through a lot of Christians, churches, that because Jesus sacrificed his life, he did that so we don't need to sacrifice, that we're off the hook somehow. That's not the teaching of the Bible. He sacrificed as an example for us. Let me give you a few verses that explain that. Mark 8:34. Of course, we had one in our scripture reading. Whoever therefore desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever wants to come after Jesus, you've got to self-deny and follow him. For whoever desires to save his life will actually lose it. But whoever loses his life or sacrifices his life for my sake in the Gospels will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? If you refuse to make the important sacrifices because you think you're gaining something, you're actually losing everything. Someone said, that which you sacrifice for God is never lost, it multiplies. You do not lose anything you sacrifice for God. Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Matthew 13:44, you know this parable. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which when a man finds it, he hides it, and for joy over it, notice the word joy. True sacrifice is beautiful. It's a blessing. For joy over it, he goes and he sells all that he has and he buys the field. I just want to give you the picture. In Bible times, they didn't have bank. They didn't have a saving and loan with a big safe in the middle of it. A lot of people, if you had money you were saving, they would actually dig a hole and bury it. And they'd pace it off and figure where they buried it and have some landmarks and maybe tell a few trusted family members in case something happened to them. You probably heard in England, these guys were out there with a metal detector. One man had a metal detector and he just was combing over the different fields because he knew that the Romans had once occupied Great Britain and they'd hidden their gold in the fields. And sure enough, his detector went off and it registered something that looked like a solid metal like gold. And they dug down and they found this, I think it's called the Hoxton Hoard. Millions of dollars of gold and stuff that someone just buried out in the field. So it wasn't uncommon in Bible times. You'd be leasing someone's field and you'd be farming and you're going along with your donkey pulling the plow. And all of a sudden the plow hits something and it unturns this rock and you look under the rock and there's a box and you look in the box and there's treasure, but you're an honest man. It's not your field, meaning it's not your treasure. So you cover it back up and you go to the owner and you say, I'd like to buy that field. He says, what would you want with that old field? He said, it's become very precious to me. And what's it going to cost? Well, he gives him the price. He said, wow. In order to do that, I'm going to have to liquidate everything. And you go home, you tell your wife, says, we're selling everything. What for? For Homer's field. Homer's field? There's nothing. Sorry you ever rented that field. What do you want to buy that field for? Trust me. You want to sell everything we've got for that field? Must have been some interesting conversations. It's worth more than they know. And they sell everything. They have a garage sale. They sell everything they've got. They put the last penny on the table and they buy Homer's field. I just made up the name Homer just because he needed that. Was it worth it? Oh yeah, he knows there's much more in the field. But Jesus said, in order to get that treasure, you got to sell everything. You got to be sold out for the gospel. And then he goes on similar parable and he says, or it's like a merchant seeking precious pearls, who when he finds a pearl of great price, he goes and he sells how much? All that he has. And he buys the field. Luke 14:27, Jesus said, whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. You pick up your cross because there's going to be a sacrifice, and if it's your cross, it's probably your sacrifice. Take your cross. You're crucified with Christ. Again, he says in Luke 4, he says it 3 times in Luke. I'm just reading you 2. Luke 14:33, so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. That means when you come to Christ, it takes everything. He wants the complete surrender. And so many, I'm sure that the reason there's a lot of miserable Christians out there is because there's a lot of people who want to go to heaven and they appreciate what Jesus did, but they're not ready to make a complete sacrifice. So they have enough religion to know about the do's and the don'ts, but they don't have the joy of really believing their sins are forgiven because they've made a partial sacrifice. And until you come to the point of really putting it all on the line for the Lord and saying, all that I have and all that I am are yours, you don't experience the freedom. That's the joy of making that sacrifice. Someone wrote that since the Son of God has died for me, the least I can do is the same for him. If Jesus is God and God died for me, then no sacrifice, really, what sacrifice is too much to make for God, who made everything, who died for you? It might mean sacrificing what looks like a high earthly position. A lot of people have decided to put the Lord first. We've heard about different athletes that in high school and college showed great promise, and then along came some pro recruiter and offered them a multi-million-dollar contract, and they said, I can't take it. Why not? Because you have games on Sabbath and I can't play on Sabbath. You're crazy. You can, just do it for 10 years and retire. No, I can't do it at all. And they sacrifice what would seem like a very lucrative career because the gospel is more important to them. I'm telling you that story because we had a call at Amazing Facts. A young man had just been recruited by the Jets, New York team. And he'd been watching our programs and he learned the Sabbath truth. And he said, I've told them I can't play anymore on the Sabbath. Well, you know, that didn't go over too well. But he stood his ground. I think ultimately they sold him and he ended up going into another field. The Bible talks about Moses, who seemed to have the promise of being in the line of Pharaoh. Hebrews 11:24. By faith, and when you make a sacrifice, it's often done by faith. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. You know, if you're associated with Pharaoh's household and you introduce yourself, name dropping, that would be handy. At any Egyptian party, oh yeah, I'm part of Pharaoh's family. But instead, he would say, I belong to the slaves. I'm with the slaves, the Hebrews. Do you understand that was reverse name dropping? He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God and lose all that prestige and power rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. You know, when we were doing our meetings back in North Carolina, Karen and I went to, there's a Billy Graham Memorial Library. I guess he's still alive. Is that still in the Memorial Library? It's the Billy Graham Library. He's 98 years old now. And there they've got a little place his wife is buried, and his good friend, George Beverly Shea. Now, how many of you know who George Beverly Shea is? Younger kids are going, oh, strange name. George Beverly Shea was a very talented singer. He's the son, actually, of a Methodist minister. And a deep, clear, booming, bass baritone voice. Articulated every word perfectly. And he, after he graduated from college, he worked for New York Life Insurance Company. And he'd sing periodically special music and Christian occasions. He loved to sing. But he had such a tremendous voice that some people with, I think it was NBC Radio, had this program across the country. The big thing back then, I'm talking 1933, was called Hit Parade. I don't expect any of you to remember that. And they said, we'd like you to be one of our singers on Hit Parade. Well, that was like the Academy Awards back then. If you were on the Hit Parade radio program, everybody knew what that was. They said, but you're going to have to sing some secular songs. You can't just do religious songs. And he said, well, I think God's given me the gift of singing. He wants me to use it for him. I'm not singing any worldly songs. You can still sing some gospel songs, but you're going to also have to sing some of the, folk songs and the traditional. I said, I don't want to do that. And all of his friends said, oh, you're crazy. Just do it for a little while. You got a chance to be known, and once you're famous, you can sing all the gospel songs you want. They wanted him to compromise just for a little bit. He said, no. He was very, very committed to the Lord. He said, I'm just going to sing for God if I'm going to sing. That's the only thing worth singing about. And they withdrew the offer. And his friend said, you missed your golden opportunity. He said, I haven't missed anything. No one ever hears who I am. They said, they'll never hear of you. Everyone will know you if you do this for a little while. He said, no, I just want God to be happy with me. Well, 10 years went by, and he continued just singing in churches and working a traditional job. Then Billy Graham asked him to sing for him for one of his evangelistic programs, 1947. And he started singing with Billy Graham, and he said, why don't you quit the insurance and go with us full-time and sing for the Lord? He said, I've been hoping someone would ask me to do that. And so he continued for the next, and folks thought his career was over because he was in his 30s. He's older than Billy Graham. And he sang with Billy Graham for 60 years. I don't know any of you remember when Billy Graham came to Arco, one of his last meetings, the Arco Arena. That must have been 20 years ago, Karen. Where are you at? Yeah. And there was George Beverly Shea up front in his 80s, singing, clear voice. It's amazing. Well, he's in the Guinness Book of World Records now for singing to more people than any other human being live. Because he traveled with Billy Graham and sang to literally millions and millions and millions of people, and there are tons of records, and he lived to 104. No one will ever hear of you, they said. And he said, some people thought it's a sacrifice. But people thought, Moses, You're missing your chance in the palace. More people know about Moses now. Here's this guy goes out in the desert and he thought, no one will ever hear from me again. I'm just following around these sheep. No one's ever going to know about me. The whole world knows about him because he chose to forsake the pleasures of sin for a season. And the Bible's full of heroes like that for you and I to think about. Of course, one of the great sacrifice stories is Abraham. What would be harder, give yourself or to give your child? What's a more difficult sacrifice? Abraham, these are the sacrifice heroes in the Bible, took his son up the mountain. He had faith, offered his son. Jephthah offered his daughter rather than to violate a vow to God. Hannah offered to sacrifice her son. She prayed for a child for years. Finally, God gives her a child. She said, I'm giving it to God. Now that's a sacrifice. He didn't die. And Jephthah, by the way, did not burn his daughter. Some people misunderstand that. He also gave his daughter to the temple. She would never marry and have children after that. Elisha, wealthy son of these farmers. They got 12 teams of oxen, and he kisses his mother and father goodbye, decides to follow Elisha and become the apprentice of a poor prophet. Really, Elisha, he lives by a creek and he's fed by birds and lives in the attic of a widow. It wasn't a very promising future to be the apprentice for a poor prophet. Lives in a cave out in the wilderness. Elisha said, I'll leave everything and follow you. And that's why when Elijah was about to go to heaven, he said, anything I can do for you? He said, yeah, I want a double portion of your inheritance, which was the Holy Spirit. And the firstborn was supposed to get a double portion of the inheritance. But he had faith, and he made that sacrifice. Nehemiah leaves the Persian palace to go and try and build these ruins in the Promised Land. The apostles. It tells us about Peter, James, John, Andrew, and Matthew. The others probably made similar sacrifices. Luke 5:11, so when they brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. So what does it cost? Most Christians don't really understand what it means to make that kind of sacrifice. Jesus tells a story. Actually, it's not a story. It's a true event. But he drew attention to this widow. Mark chapter 12. I don't hear anyone turning pages. Mark 12:41. You probably all have digital Bibles, right? You're looking on your phones. You don't hear it anymore. Used to be that, I'd give the verse and all of a sudden there'd be a flurry of air conditioning. Everybody turning their pages. Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how people put money in the treasury. He's watching it. And many who were rich, he's watching human nature parade by, many who were rich put in much. They'd blow the trumpet and everyone gathered, and so is making this donation. They go, oh, and they'd all applaud and go ooh and ah, and they drop the coins in one by one, big gold coins, big thunk on the bottom of the box. Then one poor widow, she was waiting until the fanfare drifted away, and she quietly by herself, hoping nobody would notice, she threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. Now a mite, just so you know, you got gold coins and you got silver coins, and then you had bronze coins. They weren't even copper. It was cheaper than copper. It's bronze. And it was a little bitty bronze coin. And one Bible commentator I read said, we have nothing in our currency to explain it because it was about 1/3 of a penny. So she throws in 2/3 of 1 penny, but then Jesus said it was everything she had. You might be able to buy a piece of bread with that. Oh, maybe more. I don't know what bread cost back then, but it wasn't much. And Jesus called his disciples to himself. He said, assuredly, I say to you, this poor widow, he nodded towards this widow that just went through the line, has put in more than all of those. And they can tell by the way she's dressed, she's poor. She may not only be a widow, she may be a widow with orphan children. And it says, she put in more than all those who've given to the treasury, for they put in of their abundance. But from her poverty, she put in her whole livelihood. In other words, she gave everything. Isn't it interesting? I've observed it seems like poor people, it's more easy for them to give everything. Because they figure, well, I'm so close to nothing anyway, what difference will it make? If you give your last $2, it sometimes is interesting how those who have the least give the most. They may not give the most in numeric value, but they give the most in percentage. And Jesus was calling attention to her. He says, yeah, on the scale, you might not think it's much, but she's giving 100%. And so when the Lord looks at what we give, is it the amount or is it the percentage of the heart God's interested in? Of course, I can't miss this opportunity to remind you all that our church is in the midst of a capital campaign. I'd be shameful if I missed this chance for a commercial. And what we're telling people, we're not interested in your making a pledge or commitment based on a number as though everybody can give the same amount, because we can't. But wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone made an equal sacrifice? Meaning, if we give equally, everyone's going to give differently based on the resources that we have. But if we all gave so we all felt it. A lot of people give, and you'll drive home in the same car, and you'll live under the same roof, and everything will be the same. A sacrifice means you give so you actually experience some difference. There's a vacuum. That's a sacrifice. Everything else is an offering or a donation. Sacrifice is different. The widow gave 100%. I've thought about it before. It's going to be interesting for her in the judgment. Jesus, he points to her. She was hoping that she could discreetly give her 2 cents and then slip out of the temple. And he says, see that widow? And she goes, oh no, I'm so embarrassed. I had nothing to give. He said, she gave more than anybody. Now, in the resurrection, when things take on their real value, all of the Jews who went through the temple that day and blew the trumpet, made their donations, and tried to get a lot of attention, they gave to be seen of men. And Jesus, that's all the reward they're going to get. All of their names have drifted off into obscurity. Nobody knows who they are. But when you get to heaven, the 2 cents that widow gave, by her example, has inspired more giving. I'm guessing billions and billions of dollars have come into the cause of God because Jesus drew attention to her 2 cents. It wasn't even 2 cents. 2/3 of 1 cent. Won't that be something? It's like I'm telling the story today. Hopefully it inspires you. It's been inspiring people for 2,000 years, all over the world, in virtually every church. Think about how her gift multiplied, and she probably went up to the offering box that day and thought, I know this won't make any difference. What a difference it made. You figure the whole world has been changed by that little bitty gift that she gave. So if you're thinking, well, I'd like to give, but my little bit, it won't make a big difference, you have no idea what God can do with your little gift. Because she gave her all, it's made a big difference. Sacrifice, as I mentioned, will cost you something. You remember King Saul, he came back from attacking the Amalekites. And he was supposed to exterminate all the animals there, but he kept some of them. And Samuel said to King Saul, I thought you were supposed to exterminate all those animals from the Amalekites. That was the order that came from God. He said, well, we kept some to sacrifice to God. That's kind of like you mugging your neighbor sitting by you and then making a donation from their wallet. That's your sacrifice. He says, yeah, I stole it from the Amalekites so we can give it to God. We'll get credit for that. I've told you this story probably more than once, that somebody sent me some flowers once while I was at the office. And I walk into the office, there's this big bouquet, and I read the card, and it's from actually a programmer that was congratulating us on a new program that had gone on the air on this station. And so they sent all these people flowers. And I looked at those flowers, and I thought, well, that's nice, but what am I going to do? I thought, I'm going to get some mileage out of this. So I brought it home to Karen and said, I brought you some flowers. I didn't say where they came from, but I did bring them from the office to the house. I had to finally confess exactly where they came from. But I was trying to get flower credit. Now, what do you think made more difference? to Karen, for me to say, someone sent me a bouquet. Of course, she was suspicious about that right away. Someone sent me a bouquet, and I brought you that bouquet that someone else was thinking of me, but I brought it to you because I didn't know what else to do with it. Whole bouquet, or if I actually take time and bring one flower where I thought about it. See what I'm saying? You get more credit, I think, for the one flower when you're actually thinking about it than bringing someone else's bouquet and transferring it. A real sacrifice is going to cost you something. King David, there was this plague going through Israel, and David knew he needed to make an offering to God to intercede for his people to stay the plague. And he went to this man that owned this big threshing floor named Araunah. The big threshing floor on top of Mount Moriah was right where Abraham offered Isaac. And the king said, look, I'd like to buy this threshing floor, a big flat area, and make an offering to God. And this man had a big heart. He said, you're the king. I give it to you. And the king said, no. He said, no, I want to give it to you. And David said, no, I am not going to sacrifice to the Lord something that doesn't cost me. I will not sacrifice. He said, surely I will pay you the price, nor will I offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God of that which costs me nothing. That is not a sacrifice. If it costs you nothing, it's no sacrifice. A lot of us want free Christianity. We want a discount. We want to get a good deal. We want to get it on sale. You're not going to find Christianity discounted. Now, having said all that, it's making you nervous, some of you. Biblical sacrifice is joyful. I want to read a quote to you from the book Steps to Christ, page 46. What do we give up when we give up all? A sin-polluted heart for Jesus to purify, to cleanse by his own blood, and to save by his matchless love? And yet men think it hard to give up all. I'm ashamed to hear it spoken of. I'm ashamed to write it. Hebrews 12, verse 1 and 2. It says, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, nobody made a bigger sacrifice than Jesus, but was it a sad sacrifice? Why did Jesus do it? He was looking at the joy beyond the sacrifice that would come. What is a sacrifice? Well, you forfeit something for something worth more. Jesus was looking at you being redeemed, and he thought, that's worth more. It's worth my suffering. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and he has sat down now at the right hand of the throne of God. David Livingstone, when he spent the years in Africa, and he endured all kinds of hardship, and he had malaria and hunger and exposure and threatened. He was attacked by lions and natives and all kinds of problems. And listen to what Livingstone said. People talk of the sacrifice that I've made in spending so much of my life in Africa. Can it be called a sacrifice which is simply paying back a small part of the great debt owing to our God, which we can never repay? Is it a sacrifice which brings its own blessed rewards and healthy activity, the consciousness of doing good, the peace of mind of bright hope, of glorious destiny in the future? Away with such a word and such a view, with such a thought. It is emphatically no sacrifice. Say rather, it is a privilege. I never made a sacrifice. We ought not talk of sacrifice when we remember the great sacrifice that he made, who left his Father's throne on high to give himself for us. He had a good attitude. He actually wanted to go to China, but China closed. He ended up going to Africa. He just wanted to go serve the Lord. I just thought I'd throw this in. It's interesting. An English mission society wrote to Livingstone one time when he was in Africa, and he's now in the center of Africa, and just a very difficult part. And they said, have you found a good road to where you are? If so, we'd like to send some men to join you. Livingstone wrote him back. He said, if they will only come if there's a good road, don't send them. He did make a sacrifice. Christians are often accused of being morbid when they talk of the joy of sacrificing. I think it is one of the deepest truths of the Christian religion, far from being the source of sadness. Sacrifice is the greatest joy and the source of illumination, perhaps the greatest of all joys. That's from Anonymous. I quote a lot from him. You know, an example of this would be Jacob. You remember how much did Jacob have to work for his wife? 7 years. Hard work. You read of Jacob describing the work that he did. Up all night, fighting off thieves, exposed to the cold, exposed to the heat. But he had to work 7 years for Rachel. And listen, it says in Genesis 29:20, so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. They seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. When you love somebody, it didn't seem like a sacrifice. Sometimes we give God a lame sacrifice. Ephesians 5:1-2, therefore be imitators of God, dear children, and walk in love, as Christ has also loved us and given himself for us. We want to give him the best sacrifice. Malachi says in chapter 1, verse 8, and when you offer to the Lord the blind as a sacrifice, you're supposed to give the best of your sheep. And sometimes, well, it's time to offer a sacrifice. I got the old mangy sheep I can give. There's the blind one. Well, I may as well sacrifice it. He's already blind. That one, he's kind of gimpy. He's got one bad leg. He got run over by a truck. I'll sacrifice that one. And he says, they bring these to the Lord. And he said, well, if you were going to give a donation to your governor, you don't bring a lame sack. You wouldn't offer it to your governor. You wouldn't offer it to a king. Do you offer the leftovers to the Lord or your best? Oswald Chambers said, our notion of sacrifice as though it's the wringing out of us something we don't want to give up, full of pain and agony and distress. The Bible idea of sacrifice is that I give as a love gift the very best thing I have. So why am I dwelling on this about sacrifice? Why am I talking about this? Because when I read these stories in the Bible and I think about sacrifice, I say, Lord, it'd be so easy to give 100% if I loved 100%. So if we're struggling to sacrifice and give the way God wants us to give, of our lives, of our time, of our means, of our service, whatever it is, if sacrifice is a struggle, is it that we just got to try harder? Is it that we got to love more? The more you love, the easier it is. Is it hard for a mother to care for her baby that keeps them up all night? Well, maybe sometimes. But they do it. Why? The more you love, the easier it is. And that's also true in the Christian economy. While I'm talking about parenting, sometimes we have to sacrifice convenience. And I was reading about the emperor penguin. You've probably seen these. I've probably watched the program on penguins 100 times with David Attenborough. And I always feel very sorry for the photographers that had to spend part of winter in the Antarctic to get the footage. In virtual dark, they had to watch this group of male penguins, emperor penguins, huddle in the cold for 3 months, balancing a big egg on their feet. How many of you would sign up for fathering if you knew that was involved? You don't get to eat for 3 months because you got this egg on your foot. What makes them do it? God's wired them to love their offspring. And it's so unusual because in the animal world, sometimes the father, he just, procreates and he leaves. Happens in our world too, doesn't it? But with the male penguin, he takes care of it and feeds it. And finally, the mother comes back and takes over and he goes to eat. But listen to what Paul says about the sacrifice of Christianity. 2 Corinthians 6:3. We give no offense in anything that our ministry may not be blamed, but in all things we commend ourselves as ministers of God. This is not just ministers, but all people. In much patience, in tribulations, in needs, in distresses, in stripes, in imprisonments, in tumults. Paul experienced all this. In labors, in sleeplessness, in fastings, by purity, by knowledge, by long-suffering, he starts out with the troubles, and he talks about the blessings, the beauty. By purity, by knowledge, by long-suffering, by kindness, by the Holy Spirit, by sincere love, by the word of truth, by the power of God, by the armor of righteousness on the right hand and on the left, by honor and dishonor, by evil report and good report, as deceivers and yet true, as unknown and yet well known, as dying and yet behold we live, as chastened and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor and yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing all things. This is a brilliant passage. I don't know if you caught it. He starts by talking about the sufferings, then he talks about the joys, and then he balances the sufferings with the joys in the last third. Yeah, there's bad days, but there's better days. There's dying, but we live. You're poor, but you're rich. You have nothing, but you possess all things. And so really, biblical sacrifice is beautiful. You know, it's always easy to sacrifice when you think about sacrificing something someone else has. That's what socialism does. It's really easy to vote for me to ask you to give away what you have. It's like the story of the pastor came to visit the farmer. The pastor was talking about them having a dinner to feed the poor. Well, it just so happened that outside the window, the pig and the chicken were listening. And the chicken was so moved, he said, we ought to do something to feed the poor. The pig said, what do you have in mind? So why don't we do bacon and eggs? And the pig protested. He said, well, for you, it's a donation. For me, it's total commitment. You've heard that before, haven't you? But in the Christian life, if you're going to get it, you got to give it away. The man was hiking across Nevada, and he got very thirsty. And he came to one of these ghost towns where there was an abandoned ranch. And other hikers had been there because there was a pump in the middle of the town. And there by the pump was a bottle with 1 gallon of water in it and a cap on top. And it thought, oh, good, a bottle of water. But on the bottle was a sign that says, do not drink this water. It said, if you're thirsty, pour this water down the well. It will prime the pump and you will have all the water you want. It says, trust me, it works. And the idea is you've got to give it away if you want to get it. And so it must have been hard. He said, I've got a gallon of water. Do I keep my gallon and drink it? I'll be satisfied now, but the next person will have nothing. Or do I pour it out so I'll have all I need, sacrifice it, you'll get more than you need, and you'll be able to fill the jar for the next person on the trail. So you want to know how the story ends? That's up to you. It's just an illustration. You go through this life, you can either live selfishly and try and take it all for yourself, or learn to follow Christ and say, all that I am and all that I have is yours, Lord. And like I said, it's not optional for the Christian. I remember reading about a Chinese Christian years ago. His name was Lo Fuk. Always reminded me because it sounds like forsook. And he was a barber's apprentice in China, discovered the truth about Jesus, fell in love with Jesus, and he served Jesus in his community as well as he could, became rather prosperous, but his heart was going out to so many of the poor. He had heard about many of the poor Chinese that were working in the mines in British Guyana, when they were working in the sugar plantations, and they had no one to preach Christ to them. And he offered to go preach Christ to them, but there was no ship that would take him. He said, what if I sell myself as these other Chinese have? You had to sign a 7-year contract to go work as a slave. So he sold himself as a slave for 7 years so he could go preach to the other Chinese, and every day he ended up in the gold fields. They don't have gold mines there because they were mining the rivers. He was in the gold fields, and he was preaching to the other Chinese and leading them to Christ one by one. And he ultimately, before his 7 years were up, after 5 years, he died, but he raised a church of nearly 200 people. That's someone who actually followed the teaching of Christ, where it says that he gave all things that other people, he made himself a slave, took upon the form of a slave, that he might reach others. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. This is what sacrifice means, and this is a beautiful thing. Christianity, it's not like sacrificing a baseball game where you're giving up a run, trying to get another base. It's talking about where the rubber meets the road. It's not talking about a donation. It's talking about a heart. We give our hearts to him. And when the Lord has our hearts, he has everything else. He'll have your service. He'll have your time. But what will move us to make that kind of sacrifice, to give all. It's got to be, we love him because he first loved us. When you see Jesus dying on that cross where you belong because he loved you, it should touch our hearts. If it doesn't, pray God will warm your heart. Pray God will move your heart with the Spirit. You know, sometimes I worry about people who grow up in the church and they hear about the cross all their lives and they never really understand what that means. And a little more than a year ago, I went to the Philippines. We were doing some evangelistic meetings. Just so happens it was April. It was over Easter. And you know, there's a town, it's San Fernando, I think, where they actually reenact crucifixions. They don't act, though. People volunteer themselves to be crucified. And everybody gathers around to watch this. I took Nathan with me. I kind of didn't know whether I should or not. He was adult. But it's very troubling. These people are trying to show God honor, and with people watching, there must have been, half a dozen that actually went through crucifixion where they had, they got guards there and they got stainless steel nails and they got a first aid, but they nailed them to cross, they hoist them up, they put microphones on them so you can hear them cry when they do it. We had our media team there and we thought it would be footage we could use in our Amazing Facts program, and we did use actually some of it. But, I heard about crucifixion and you read about it and I preached about it, but you see that, and this was all a very sanitized form of a crucifixion. And that Jesus would offer to do that to save me. And not just, then they take these guys down from the cross and they give them first aid. Jesus, he didn't come down, he died. And to be willing to do that, because he loves you so much, it ought to stir you. The Holy Spirit ought to touch our hearts and say, Lord, I'm willing to give my life for you because you're God. So you own me because you created me. And you're my Savior. You own me because you bought me back. And I am willing to sacrifice for you my life. Is that your desire?